Welcome to From the Region with Richard Giragosian. Every week we present an analysis of current developments in the broader region affecting Armenia and a look at developments within Armenia proper. This week's focus will be looking at the major players in the Armenian economy and Armenian politics. There's been considerable attention lately in terms of the role of the oligarchs, the so-called oligarchs in Armenia, businessmen who are exerting a unique and powerful influence over Armenian politics and the Armenian economy. But let's start from the beginning. The role of the oligarch, or the definition of an oligarch in Armenia, needs to be addressed and assessed. In many ways, what we see in Armenia is not monopolies. More specifically, we see several commodity-based cartels, where several powerful businessmen and business interests control or dominate the import and export of key commodities in the Armenian economy, ranging from sugar to tobacco to cooking oil, etc. Now, we talk a lot about the closed nature of the Armenian economy and the closed nature of Armenian politics. Much of this is rooted in the power of these commodity-based cartels. But let's start at the beginning. How did oligarchs come to exist in Armenia? In many ways, we trace the development of today's closed economy to the 1990s, to the conflict economics during the Karabakh War, scarcity of goods because of the blockade, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Soviet central planning. In terms of affecting the Armenian transformation to a market economy, allowed for many powerful businessmen to emerge in the wake of corruption within privatization, but also because of scarcity of goods, allowing small cartels to be formed based on their dominant share of the market over key commodities. In many countries, this is an equally serious problem. In the United States, for example, at the turn of the century, the American example had its own oligarchs. Carnegie, Vanderbilt, etc. Standard Oil was a leading monopoly or cartel, as well as the railroad sector in the American experience. The reason the oligarchs in America were defeated eventually was because of political will. Presidents Teddy Roosevelt and subsequent American administrations were known to impose new policies known as cartel busting, imposing new laws and regulations, preventing the emergence of cartels and monopolies. The other experience from America as a best practice that worked was bringing the oligarchs into the legitimate economy. And in this way, whether it was paying taxes and revenue collection or abiding by the rule of law, the American experience overcame the challenge of oligarchs. The players in the Armenian economy, or the role of the oligarchs, is especially powerful because of the weak rule of law and a lack of a separation of power. Mainly a lack of a separation of checks and balances between the powerful business interests and the political. Business and politics, and that marriage is actually resulting in a rather closed and very secretive nature of governance in Armenia. But in terms of economics, what's most interesting is there's been a lot of new attention to the powerfully negative effect of the oligarchs in Armenia. For example, in the Armenian media, we see two recent developments. One is the opposition Armenian National Congress released a very instructive and very thorough analysis looking at the role of 76 members of the Armenian parliament who are in violation of ethics laws in terms of being engaged in big business while also serving in parliament. But the second development is more recent and more serious. There was significant media coverage of one incident where a child was hospitalized because he was poisoned by expired oatmeal and baby food. And this was traced to the role of one oligarch in particular, Samvel Alexandyan. This member of parliament is controlling the sugar imports and exports of Armenia, but likewise holds a dominant share of a large supermarket chain in Armenia. What was most revealing about this case was it revealed a deeper trend or a deeper problem in the Armenian economy, affecting consumers and affecting ordinary citizens. This was tampering illegally with the expiration dates for children's food, baby food. What was equally troubling was the same problem has been found in the pharmaceutical or medical industry in Armenia. In other words, baby food and medicines are usually and unfortunately being sold past their expiration date, mainly because many of these oligarchs, including Mr. Alexanyan, control the entire supply chain, from supply and import to distribution to marketing and sales, and are selling defective and dangerous goods in the Armenian market. What this reveals, however, is a deeper problem of a lack of oversight by the government in allowing the defective and dangerous goods to enter the Armenian market. It also shows the power, inordinate power, of many of these oligarchs who control and dominate key shares of the market based on their position as commodity importers and exporters. This has an effect in terms of economic development, in a lack of competition, in many cases involving price fixing, where a commodity-based cartel will set the price, not based on market economics, but based on sheer business interest. And the lack of competition, coupled with the weak rule of law, makes this especially powerfully negative and a serious development affecting economic reform in Armenia. What also is most unacceptable is these two cases of selling dangerous products such as baby food and medicines are affecting the weakest of the Armenian population, children and young people and the elderly, who actually have no voice and little choice in Armenian politics, but in Armenian economics. The consumer is often robbed, and the consumer is actually violated in terms of a lack of protection of basic consumer rights. And the deeper problem structurally is, of course, the lack of competition in terms of pricing in Armenia. But the reason we're looking at key players in economics and politics is because many of the key economic players are also now key, powerful political players. One example is Mr. Gagik Tsarukyan, the founder and head of Prosperous Armenia, Bargavach Hayastan, the second most powerful political party in Armenia. What's important of his case is, as head of Multigroup, he is a corporate executive. He is a leading businessman, modeling himself on the Italian model of Berlusconi. But the problem here is these economic oligarchs have entered the political arena. And the reason this is especially dangerous is because the deeper trend of the relationship between business and politics means that many of these oligarchic interests are able, through their positions in the parliament, to impact the course of economic reform. What's equally troubling, especially for the Armenian government, is these very same oligarchs, despite being political players, by underpaying taxes, by not paying taxes or engaging in corruption in general, and price fixing in more specifically, are actually threatening the state by undermining the authority and fiscal operations of the government. What makes this different than before is that the oligarchs have now emerged as economic and political players in actually becoming a direct threat to the state itself. And this is a security concern for long-term economic development as well. Now, the reason we're talking about this is because we have several leading businessmen in Armenia who are best known to Armenians by very colorful nicknames. Mr. Tsarukyan, Mr. Alexanyan, even Mr. Hayrabetyan, the head of the Armenian Football Association, is also engaged in business. We have a number of these leading oligarchs who are now not only exerting political power and influence, but are actually representing the real deeper problem, the lack of competition, but the lack of checks and balances between power and overpower. What we see here is a weak rule of law, but an even weaker political will designed to take on the threat from the oligarchs. And the real challenge for the government now is being able to reinforce or restore control and legal oversight over the role of the oligarchs. Now, public outrage is mounting, and it does reflect a wider and deeper problem: the widening disparities of wealth and power in Armenia, where the oligarchs represent a very small percentage of the population, but a very wealthy and powerful elite. And for the ordinary Armenian, this very egregious or very obvious disparity of wealth and income is increasingly being unacceptable. At the same time, the government is finally realizing and recognizing that the oligarchs, by underpaying taxes and by maintaining a very closed economic system, are directly undermining the state's authority and fiscal operations. In other words, the ability for the government to carry out and implement the state budget. Without adequate tax collection, many of these larger oligarchs have also been crowding out or preventing the emergence of competition from small and medium-sized businesses. This is also important in terms of future economic development, because in many ways, the oligarchs also represent barriers to entry, barriers or obstacles to new business development and job creation within Armenia. In the political context, we see also an incestuous relationship between political leaders and the oligarchs or business interests themselves. But when we look at the players in Armenian politics, this is much more than the president or the prime minister. This involves Hovig Abrahamian, the Speaker of Parliament. This involves other key figures in the Armenian economy and politics who are exerting inordinate control and influence behind the scenes without ethics and regulations applicable to their business interests or to their investments. What we're going to do next week as well is to take this discussion one step further and to provide a pre-election preview of each political party and political figure, who they really are, what their interests are, the different ideologies or political platforms, and to examine in an objective way the political landscape as Armenia now enters the pre-election season in advance of parliamentary elections next year, followed by presidential elections the year after. Thank you for joining us, and next week we will continue this discussion with a pre-election overview. And thank you for watching From the Region with Richard Giragosian.